I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Not the distant hum of farm equipment or a neighbor's lawnmower, this was something else. Something closer. Something wrong. Still groggy, I pushed aside the curtains, and my heart nearly stopped. A bulldozer. Right there, on my land, its massive blade angled toward my fence like it was about to carve through my property. My breath caught as I spotted the group of men standing nearby, clipboards in hand, nodding as if approving the destruction before it even began. And then I saw her, Natalie, the HOA president, arms crossed, wearing that smug expression that meant she thought she had already won. My mind raced. There had to be some mistake. I wasn't in an HOA. My property was privately owned, free from their ridiculous bylaws and overreaching rules. I had made sure of that when I bought this land, double-checking every record, every boundary line. And yet, here they were, standing on my soil, about to tear through my fence like it belonged to them. Fury surged through me as I threw on a jacket and stormed outside. The morning air was crisp, but my blood was boiling. I barely got a word out before Natalie raised a hand like she was a queen addressing a lowly subject. "You were given sufficient warning," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, "but you've left us no choice. The HOA has determined that your lawn is non-compliant with community standards, and as per our regulations, we are authorized to take corrective action." My pulse hammered in my ears. "You have no jurisdiction over my property," I snapped. "This land is mine, legally, fully documented. You can't just waltz in and start tearing things down." One of the clipboard-wielding men, a middle-aged guy in a cheap suit, cleared his throat. "According to newly updated HOA boundaries, this property falls under association oversight. You failed to apply for landscaping approval, and your non-standard vegetation poses a threat to neighborhood aesthetics." Non-standard vegetation. They were talking about my grass. My garden. My trees. The land I had painstakingly restored after years of neglect. The wildflowers I had let flourish, the ones that attracted bees and butterflies, the patches of clover that helped nourish the soil. I wasn't destroying the neighborhood, I was preserving something real, something natural. But in their eyes, it wasn't uniform, wasn't sterile, wasn't stamped with their overpriced suburban seal of approval. I took a step forward, my fists clenched. "You don't get to rewrite property laws just because you don't like my yard." Natalie smirked. "We'll see about that." Then, with a snap of her fingers, she signaled the bulldozer driver to move forward. The engine rumbled, the ground trembled beneath my feet, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that this was more than just a power trip. The HOA wasn't just trying to fine me or harass me into compliance. They were trying to take my home that I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over as I ran straight toward the bulldozer, waving my arms, forcing the driver to hit the brakes. The massive machine came to a heavy, rumbling stop just inches from my fence. I could feel the heat from its engine, smell the diesel in the air, hear the faint hissing of hydraulic pressure still lingering like a coiled snake ready to strike. Natalie raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, while the clipboard men whispered among themselves. They were expecting me to back down, to step aside, to let them roll over my land without a fight. But I wasn't going anywhere. I planted my feet and dared them to make their next move. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, until one of the men stepped forward, holding out a document as if it were a royal decree. The words blurred in front of me as my pulse pounded in my ears, but I caught enough, something about newly revised zoning regulations, an annexation of properties into the HOA's oversight, a mandatory compliance order that they claimed had been delivered weeks ago. I had never seen this letter before. It wasn't just oversight. This was a setup. They had rewritten the rules behind my back, redrawn the boundaries on paper, and conveniently forgot to notify me. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. This was about control. I snatched the paper and scanned it, my hands tightening around the edges. They were citing obscure bylaws, twisting legal jargon to justify what was happening, using technicalities to strong-arm me into compliance. My mind raced through my options. If I called the sheriff, would they even take my side? If I fought back legally, how much time did I have before they drained me with endless fines and court fees? The HOA thrived on exhaustion, on wearing people down until they had no choice but to surrender. That was how they won. That was how they had turned entire neighborhoods into their personal kingdoms. But I wasn't going to let them do that to me. I took a slow breath and forced myself to stay calm. There had to be a way to stop this, to turn the tables before they buried me in bureaucracy. My property records, my deed, my legal proof, I needed to get those in front of the right eyes before it was too late. If they were changing the rules, I had to expose them before they solidified their grip. But for now, I had to hold my ground. I locked eyes with Natalie, who was watching me like a hunter sizing up wounded prey. I knew she was waiting for me to crumble, to give in and let her erase everything I had built. I tightened my grip on the letter and took a step closer, my voice low, measured, unwavering. I told them I wasn't signing anything, wasn't agreeing to their fabricated claims, wasn't moving an inch. They had no authority here, and if they took one step onto my land with that bulldozer, I would make sure the entire county knew what they were doing. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of hesitation, the slight narrowing of her gaze. She had expected me to cave. But now she wasn't so sure. The bulldozer sat still, its driver waiting for a signal that never came. The clipboard men fidgeted, shifting from foot to foot, suddenly uncomfortable with how far things were escalating. And Natalie, for the first time, didn't have a smirk on her face. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I had just thrown the first wrench into their plans. I turned, walking back toward my house without another word, leaving them standing there, knowing full well that the real battle was just beginning. That I barely made it inside before my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I knew better than to answer, but something told me this wasn't just another spam call. I let it ring once more before picking up, my grip tightening around the phone as I braced myself. A clipped, formal voice greeted me, announcing that they were a legal representative for the Homeowners Association. Without hesitation, they launched into a pre-rehearsed spiel, stating that I was in direct violation of community regulations and that further refusal to comply would result in escalating legal action, fines, and potential property seizure. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay silent, letting them talk, listening for the cracks in their argument. They were playing their hand too fast, too aggressively, pushing me toward fear, expecting me to break under pressure. But fear only worked when someone believed they were powerless. I wasn't. The call ended with a thinly veiled threat about upcoming legal proceedings. I set the phone down and exhaled slowly, my mind already working through the next steps. They were using intimidation, bureaucracy, and legal loopholes as weapons, but that also meant they were desperate. If they had an airtight case, they wouldn't need to resort to scare tactics. I needed proof, something that would shatter their claims before they could drag me into a legal nightmare. My property deed, the original zoning maps, and any record proving that my land had never been under their jurisdiction, I had to get them in order fast. Stepping into my home office, I pulled open my filing cabinet and started flipping through folders, scanning document after document, looking for the right papers. The past few months of peace I had found on this land felt distant now, replaced by a sharp, buzzing urgency in the back of my skull. I had fought hard for this place, for the space, for the freedom to live without pointless interference. I wasn't going to let a group of power-hungry bureaucrats strip that away just because they decided my land belonged to them. Outside, I heard the sound of car doors slamming. My pulse spiked as I walked back toward the window, peering through the blinds. 3 vehicles were parked near my driveway, all black, all unmarked. A group of men stood just beyond the fence line, not stepping onto my property but standing close enough to make their presence known. Watching. Waiting. Documenting. They weren't here to talk. They were here to intimidate. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures, making sure to capture their faces, the cars, the license plates. If they were going to push, I was going to push back. I had seen this kind of tactic before, constant presence, making someone feel surrounded, hoping to chip away at their confidence until they surrendered. But I wasn't built that way. If they thought standing outside my home with their cheap intimidation tactics was enough to break me, they had seriously underestimated their opponent. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The men outside didn't move, just lingered like vultures circling something they assumed was already dead. I kept the lights on, kept moving, making sure they saw me working, making sure they knew I wasn't hiding, wasn't scared. When the sun finally started to set, they left just as silently as they arrived. But I knew this wasn't their final visit. Later that night, I sat on my porch, the cool air doing little to calm the fire burning in my chest. The HOA wasn't just fighting me on paper anymore. They were escalating, testing how far they could push before I broke. But they were making a mistake. They had backed me into a corner, and if they thought I was going to surrender, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my body already tuned to the fight ahead. Sleep had been a fragile thing, slipping in and out of reach as my mind ran through every possible scenario, every move they might make next. I stepped outside with my coffee, letting the cold morning air settle into my lungs, grounding myself before the day began. The driveway was empty. No cars, no lurking figures, no immediate threats. But I knew better than to assume they had given up. This was only a pause, a breath before the next blow. They had made their intentions clear. They weren't just trying to find me, harass me, or force me to comply. They were trying to break me. And if they couldn't do it through legal intimidation, they would find another way. I spent the next few hours organizing every piece of paperwork I had, making digital backups, printing multiple copies, and ensuring that I had everything I needed to counter their claims. The legal battle was coming, and I needed to be ahead of it. But there was another fight happening, one that wasn't fought in courtrooms or through certified letters. It was being fought in my own neighborhood. I had already seen the way my neighbors avoided me, how conversations died when I walked by, how the once friendly nods had been replaced by stiff glances. The HOA had been working behind the scenes, poisoning the well, turning the community against me before I even had a chance to defend myself. I wasn't just battling paperwork. I was fighting perception. By noon, my suspicion was confirmed. A letter arrived, not from the HOA but from a legal firm representing a group of homeowners who had filed a complaint against me. The accusations were laughable, claims that my property was lowering the value of the neighborhood, that my refusal to comply with HOA regulations was a deliberate act of hostility, that I was creating a disturbance within the community. It was an orchestrated move, designed to add more pressure, to make me feel isolated, to push me into a position where the fight wasn't just against a board of bureaucrats but against an entire group of people who had once been my neighbors. It was a tactic as old as time, divide and conquer. I wasn't going to play into it. If they wanted to paint me as a problem, I would make sure they saw the real issue for what it was. I printed copies of my deed, the original property lines, the zoning laws that proved my land was never under their jurisdiction. Then, I crafted a letter of my own, one that laid out the facts in cold, irrefutable terms. I wasn't the one breaking the law. The HOA was. And if they wanted to continue this fight, they would be facing a much larger battle than they expected. By the time I stepped outside to start delivering my message, the first sign of their next move had already arrived. A tow truck idled near my driveway, its driver leaning against the door, waiting for something, or someone. A second vehicle, an HOA-branded truck, was parked just down the road. And then I saw Natalie. Standing near the curb, arms crossed, watching. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't here for another warning. They were here to take my truck. I moved fast, crossing the yard before they could make their move, already knowing what excuse they would use. Illegal parking, some fabricated violation of neighborhood vehicle regulations, another power play to force me into submission. I reached my truck just as the tow driver stepped forward, clipboard in hand, a smirk on his face like he had already won. But they had underestimated me. I pulled out my phone, already recording, listing every violation of property rights, every legal statute they were ignoring, making sure I documented every second of their latest stunt. Natalie's expression darkened as she realized what I was doing. The tow driver hesitated, clearly rethinking whether this was worth the hassle. And then, just as I expected, the police arrived. Not because they had been called to stop this, but because the HOA had called them first. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car, scanning the scene before approaching me. I could already feel the weight of the narrative being spun against me. The dangerous homeowner refusing to comply, the aggressive man standing in the way of lawful HOA enforcement. I took another deep breath, steadying myself as I turned to face them. I had been ready for this moment. And if they thought I was going to crumble, they were about to be very, very disappointed. The officers approached with measured steps, their expressions unreadable as they glanced between me, the tow truck, and Natalie, who had now adopted an air of calculated distress. The scene had been carefully arranged, every element placed to make me look like the aggressor, the one defying authority, the problem that needed to be handled. The tow truck, the HOA vehicle, the legal threats, it had all been leading to this. They wanted to make me snap, to give them a reason to paint me as unstable, non-compliant, a liability. But I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. I kept my phone raised, still recording, still capturing every detail. The officers asked what was happening, and before I could respond, Natalie stepped forward, her voice laced with exaggerated concern. She spoke of ongoing violations, of my refusal to acknowledge community standards, of repeated warnings ignored. She gestured toward the tow truck as if this was a necessary action, not an abuse of power. It was all so perfectly rehearsed that for a moment, I almost admired the effort. Almost. But I had come prepared. I handed over my property records, the zoning maps, the proof that my land was not and never had been under HOA jurisdiction. My voice was calm, clear, unwavering as I explained the illegal annexation attempts, the intimidation tactics, the harassment disguised as enforcement. The officers flipped through the paperwork, their brows furrowing as they reached the critical parts. I could see it, the shift, the realization that this wasn't the simple dispute they had been led to believe. Natalie's confidence wavered. Her arms tightened across her chest as the officers continued reading. The tow truck driver, sensing the shift in energy, took a small step back, no longer so eager to hook up my vehicle. The silence stretched until one of the officers let out a breath and turned to Natalie, asking if the HOA had legal documentation proving that my property was within their authority. The hesitation that followed was all the answer anyone needed. She faltered, scrambling for words, insisting that their jurisdiction had been updated, that the boundaries had changed. But the officer shook his head, stating that without official government-recognized documents confirming such changes, the HOA had no standing to enforce anything on my land. He turned to the tow truck driver and instructed him to leave, and after only a second of resistance, the man relented, climbing into his cab and driving off without another word. The HOA's plan had collapsed in real time. Natalie's face had gone pale, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling under the weight of reality. But I knew she wasn't done. She had lost this round, but people like her never walked away quietly. As she turned, her eyes met mine for just a second, and in that brief moment, I saw something worse than anger. I saw calculation. She wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. The officers returned my documents, apologizing for the inconvenience, assuring me that they would be updating their records to prevent further issues. I thanked them, but I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had thrown their biggest punch yet, and they had failed, but they weren't out of weapons. If they couldn't intimidate me legally, they would find another way. And as I watched Natalie walk back to her car, I knew one thing for certain: she wasn't leaving to accept defeat. She was leaving to plan her next move. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, scanning through every document, every legal statute that could protect me. They had underestimated me once, and it had cost them. If they tried again, I would be ready. But as I finally turned off the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Somewhere, in the darkness beyond my property, I could sense it, that lingering presence, that silent threat. The HOA had played their hand, but something told me their next move would be far more dangerous. The final confrontation didn't come with another letter, another fine, or another legal notice. It came in the dead of night, wrapped in silence, carried out by hands that thought they wouldn't be seen. I had fallen into a light sleep, my body still tense from the battles of the past few days, when a sound pulled me awake. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of gravel, the whisper of movement where there shouldn't have been any. My pulse quickened, my instincts kicking in before my mind fully caught up. Something was wrong. I slipped out of bed and moved toward the window, keeping to the shadows as I peered outside. The moon cast long, distorted shadows across my land, but it wasn't the night that unsettled me. It was the figures moving through it. 3 of them, dressed in dark clothes, creeping along the fence line near my barn. My breath came slow, measured, as my mind raced through possibilities. This wasn't random. This wasn't just trespassing. This was them. The HOA had finally abandoned their legal games and moved on to something worse: intimidation in its purest form. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't make a sound. Instead, I moved quickly, grabbing my phone, activating the cameras I had installed around the property, making sure every angle was recorded. Then, I made my way toward the back door, slipping outside without so much as a whisper. The night air was cold against my skin, but the fire burning inside me kept me warm. I stayed low, moving with careful steps through the grass, getting closer, getting a better look. They weren't vandals. They were here with purpose. One of them was holding a canister, something heavy in his grip. Another was crouched near the barn's side wall, pressing something against the wood. A sick realization hit me all at once: gasoline. They were trying to burn me out. My fingers clenched around my phone as I hit the emergency call button, whispering my location to the dispatcher, making sure every detail was recorded. But I wasn't going to wait for help to arrive. This was my land. My fight. My moment to end this once and for all. I stepped forward, making my presence known just enough to send a ripple of panic through them. The one holding the gas canister froze first, his head snapping up as I shone a flashlight directly at his face. His features twisted in shock, and then fear. The others whipped around, momentarily stunned, caught between running and defending their pathetic excuse for a plan. I let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of what they had just been caught doing. Then, I spoke, low, calm, controlled. I told them exactly what was happening. That they were being recorded. That the police were on their way. That every action they had taken had been documented. And that if they moved one step further, this wouldn't just be an HOA dispute anymore. This would be a criminal case. One of them bolted first, a younger guy, clearly not built for this level of confrontation. The second hesitated, his eyes darting toward the darkened road before he followed. But the third, he didn't run. He stood his ground, his hands tightening into fists, the challenge in his stance clear. He thought he could scare me, thought that standing his ground now would somehow undo the reality of what he had just been caught doing. But he wasn't the one holding the power here. I was. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just kept the light steady on him, kept my voice level as I repeated exactly what would happen next. The sirens in the distance must have made the decision for him because finally, after a long moment, he turned and disappeared into the night. But I knew who he was. I had seen his face. And so had my cameras. By the time the police arrived, I had everything ready. The footage, the faces, the clear evidence of what had just been attempted. And when I handed it over, when I let them see the extent of what the HOA had resorted to, their expressions told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just trespassing. This wasn't just harassment. This was attempted arson. And that changed everything. The fallout was swift. Natalie, for all her arrogance, had no way to talk her way out of this one. The men who had been caught that night were tied directly to her, hired under the table, acting under her orders. The moment she realized how deep she was, how much evidence there was against her, she folded. She resigned from the HOA in disgrace, her influence collapsing under the weight of her own corruption. The legal case against her was out of my hands, but I knew it wouldn't end well for her. The same people who had once followed her blindly were now the ones turning against her the fastest. As for the HOA itself, the damage had been done. Their reputation, their authority, their entire foundation had been shaken beyond repair. The community saw them for what they were. The new leadership, scrambling to distance themselves from Natalie's disaster, reached out to me, offering to drop every previous attempt to claim my property, to erase the fabricated fines, to leave me alone. And I made it clear, I didn't need their permission to exist. They never had power over me to begin with. In the end, I got exactly what I had fought for. My land. My peace. My freedom. The HOA had tried to take everything from me, but they had failed. Because they had underestimated one simple truth, I wasn't the kind of person who backed down. I never was. And now, they knew that too.